In 1999, workers renovating Savannah's oldest hotel ripped up the floorboards and found human bones, arms, legs, hands, shoved beneath the wood over a century earlier. The bones were Civil War amputations from when the Marshall House served as a Union hospital. But in Savannah, this barely made the news. The city is built on its dead. Beneath the cobblestones and garden squares lie thousands of bodies. Yellow fever victims in mass graves, colonial settlers, burial grounds paved over without a marker. Savannah has been called America's most haunted city. The real question is why it's still alive at all. That hotel on Broughton Street opened in 1851. By the time those bones turned up beneath its floorboards, the Marshall House had already served as a hospital 3 separate times. Once during the Civil War, and twice during yellow fever epidemics that tore through Savannah like a slow fire nobody could put out. The story those bones tell is not just about one building. It's about a city that death visited so many times, so relentlessly, that the dead became part of the infrastructure, part of the soil, and eventually, part of the business model. But Savannah didn't start as a place of ghosts. It started as a dream. Arguably the most idealistic colonial experiment in American history. In February 1733, a man named James Oglethorpe stepped off a ship called the Anne with roughly 114 settlers and climbed a bluff overlooking the Savannah River. Oglethorpe was a British reformer, a member of Parliament who had spent years investigating debtors' prisons and decided the solution was a new colony. Georgia, the 13th and final American colony, would be different. No slavery, no hard liquor, no lawyers, a society of equals. And the physical plan he drew for the city was unlike anything else in the New World. Oglethorpe laid Savannah out in a grid of public squares, open green spaces surrounded by residential lots and civic buildings. Each square was a self-contained neighborhood, a small commons where people gathered, traded, argued, prayed. Over the next century, 24 of these squares would be built. 22 still survive. They give Savannah its rhythm, its shade, its strange beauty. Walk through the historic district and you move from square to square like rooms in a house, each one different, each one heavy with trees. Live oaks draped in Spanish moss, iron benches, fountains, silence in the middle of a city. That grid is the reason Savannah looks the way it does. And it's the reason the city would eventually become worth saving, worth fighting over, worth dying in, worth writing about, worth haunting. Oglethorpe also struck an extraordinary friendship with Chief Tomochichi, leader of the Yamacraw people, who granted the colonists the land they needed. The two men couldn't speak each other's language without an interpreter, but they came to rely on each other. When Tomochichi died years later, he received full military honors at his funeral. A granite boulder marking his grave still rests in Wright Square, one of Oglethorpe's own squares. The man who made room for the colony buried beneath the grid the colony became. But Oglethorpe's idealism didn't survive first contact with economics. The ban on slavery lasted only 18 years. By 1751, royal decree overturned it. The ban on rum fell even earlier. Oglethorpe returned to England for the last time, never to see Georgia again. He died in 1785 at the age of 88, on the same year the American Revolution formally ended, never knowing what his colony would become. And what it became was a machine for producing wealth on the backs of enslaved people. The money came from cotton. Just 10 miles outside Savannah, on a plantation called Mulberry Grove, a young Yale graduate named Eli Whitney arrived in 1792 to work as a tutor. Within months, he'd built a machine that would reshape the American South and deepen the country's dependence on slavery for the next 70 years. The cotton gin, short for engine, could separate the sticky green seeds from short staple cotton faster than 50 people working by hand. Whitney patented it in 1794. He never made much money from it because the design was so simple that everyone copied it. But the machine turned cotton into white gold, and Savannah sat at the mouth of the river that carried it all to the sea. By the 1830s, Savannah had become the third largest cotton exporter in the American South, behind only New Orleans and Mobile. Railroads brought bales from inland Georgia and as far away as Alabama and Tennessee. Cotton warehouses lined the riverfront, thick-walled stone buildings on cobblestone streets that still stand today, converted now into restaurants and gift shops. The Savannah Cotton Exchange, built in 1887, would set global prices for the commodity. At its peak, Savannah shipped more than 500,000 bales a year. That's a staggering volume for a city of its size. The wealth it generated was visible in every new mansion on every new square. Italianate townhouses, Greek Revival facades, ironwork balconies, interiors furnished with European porcelain and silver. But cotton was a trap disguised as a fortune. Every dollar of that wealth depended on a single crop processed by enslaved labor, and the scale of that dependence was enormous. By 1860, Georgia had 14,500 cotton plantations. Of the 4 million enslaved people in the American South, roughly 2.5 million worked in cotton fields. Savannah was the marketplace. Slave brokers operated openly in Johnson Square, one of Oglethorpe's original gathering places, now used to buy and sell human beings. In March 1859, the largest recorded slave auction in American history took place 3 miles from downtown Savannah at the Ten Brook Racetrack. Pierce Meese Butler, a Philadelphia plantation owner drowning in gambling debts, put 436 men, women, and children up for sale over 2 days. Families were separated. Children were torn from parents. Butler shook hands with some of the people he was selling and gave each one $1. The auction netted him $303,850, more than $10 million in today's money. It rained the entire 2 days. Witnesses later called it the weeping time, and some said the rain only stopped when the last person was sold. Whether that detail is true or legend, it became part of Savannah's fabric, another layer of grief folded into the soil. And grief had already been accumulating for decades. The year 1820 was the year Savannah nearly ceased to exist. On January 11th, just before 2 in the morning, a fire broke out in a livery stable behind a boarding house on Franklin Square. The wind was strong and dry, and the flames jumped from building to building through the densely packed commercial district. When the fire reached the city market, 2 explosions, from gunpowder that had been illegally stored there, sent the crowd fleeing in panic. By morning, 463 buildings had burned. The entire commercial center was gutted. 200 families were homeless. Damage reached an estimated $4 million, the equivalent of roughly $90 million today. It was, at the time, one of the worst urban fires in American history. Only the width of Broughton Street saved the southern half of the city from total destruction. People roamed the cold January streets half closed. Looting broke out immediately. Cities across the country sent relief funds: Boston, Philadelphia, Charleston. The irony was bitter. The same commercial district that had burned in 1796 burned again in 1820. The city had rebuilt on the exact same lots, in the exact same materials, in the exact same configuration. And the same lots burned the same way. President James Monroe visited Savannah that year and stayed at Scarborough House, where he spent a day aboard the SS Savannah, the first steamship to cross the Atlantic. The city was supposed to be entering its golden age. Instead, it was entering a year of compound catastrophe. Because before Savannah could even begin rebuilding, the fever arrived. Dr. William Waring noticed the first unusual case on June 26, 1820. His patient's fever didn't follow the familiar cycle of malaria. It burned steady and high. The man died in 3 days. Within weeks, more cases appeared. The skin turned yellow. The gums bled. People vomited black bile. Yellow fever, carried, though no one knew it yet, by mosquitoes breeding in the standing water of a low-lying port city, swept through Savannah that summer and fall with a fury that even the fire hadn't matched. The newspapers didn't hide it. They published the death toll daily. Mayor Thomas U.P. Charlton posted public addresses urging people to leave the city. Those who could afford to flee did. Those who couldn't, the poor, the enslaved, the sick, stayed behind. By December, the official register listed 695 white victims by name. The registrar confessed he had no names for the black victims, but estimated at least 200 more. That was almost certainly a dramatic undercount. In a city of roughly 7,500 people, the death ratio was approximately 1 in 10. 1 in 10 people in Savannah died in a single season. Here's a detail worth sitting with. New York City offered $12,500 in relief funds, but attached a condition. The money had to be distributed to all indigent persons without regard to race. Savannah City Council rejected the donation. They found the condition insulting, so the money never arrived and people kept dying. And the yellow fever kept coming back. It wasn't a one-time catastrophe. It was a recurring nightmare that shaped the city's psychology for generations. A devastating epidemic struck again in 1854, killing more than 1,000 people the same year a hurricane flooded the rice and cotton plantations and wrecked the port. Another epidemic hit in 1876, killing 1,066, 6% of the city's population. In the 6 weeks after the first case was identified that year, roughly 5,000 residents, nearly 1 in 5, fled the city entirely. Throughout the 19th century, yellow fever was Savannah's unsolvable problem. Nobody knew what caused it. Some doctors blamed the climate. Others blamed the ships coming from West Africa. Some believed you could catch it just by standing near someone who was sick. None of them were right. The answer, mosquitoes, wouldn't be proven until 1900. By then, thousands had already been buried. And buried is almost too generous a word. During the worst of the epidemics, bodies went into mass graves. Colonial Park Cemetery, which opened in 1750, became the repository for the dead of multiple catastrophes. More than 9,000 people are buried there, though far fewer headstones remain. Storms, neglect, and the passage of time erased the markers. Some graves were simply built over. The cemetery also served as Savannah's informal dueling ground from the 1740s all the way to 1877. How many men died on those grounds in duels is unknown. Their identities, like so many others in Savannah, are lost beneath the grass. This is the pattern that makes Savannah different. The city didn't just experience death, it absorbed it, built over it, paved it, walked on it. Entire neighborhoods sit on top of burial grounds. Native American, colonial, African American. Graves were disturbed, covered, forgotten. The phrase that ghost tour guides use is hard to argue with. Savannah is the city that lives upon its dead. And then came the war that should have destroyed what the fire and the fever hadn't. By the time General William Tecumseh Sherman reached the outskirts of Savannah in December 1864, his army had already burned Atlanta and cut a 60-mile-wide path of destruction across Georgia. 60,000 Union troops marched 285 miles in 3 weeks, wrecking railroads, burning barns, seizing livestock, and making the civilian population feel, as Sherman put it, the hard hand of war. Savannah was next. Confederate General William Hardee had 10,000 troops defending the city. Sherman sent him a message that was more threat than negotiation. He had guns that could reach the heart of the city, and if forced to resort to assault, he would make little effort to restrain his army. Hardee took the threat seriously. His forces retreated across the Savannah River into South Carolina, and the mayor surrendered the city without a fight. On December 22, 1864, Sherman sent a telegram to President Abraham Lincoln. I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Not a single mansion was burned. Not a square was destroyed. Sherman took up residence in the Green Meldrum House, a Gothic revival mansion owned by a British cotton merchant, and spent Christmas in one of the most beautiful cities he hadn't destroyed. Why did Sherman spare Savannah? The popular story is that he found it too beautiful to burn. That may be partly true, but the military calculation was simpler. Savannah had no strategic value left. The port was blockaded. The Confederate garrison had fled. The 25,000 bales of cotton sitting in the warehouses were worth a fortune to the Union. Burning the city would have destroyed the prize. Sherman was practical before he was sentimental. But the survival came at a cost Savannah didn't immediately understand. And this is one of the great ironies of American urban history. Because Atlanta burned, Atlanta rebuilt from nothing on its own terms into a modern railroad hub and eventually the economic capital of the New South. Destruction gave Atlanta permission to start over. Savannah survived intact, which meant it also survived frozen. The grand houses still stood. The squares still held their shape. The cotton warehouses still lined the river. But the cotton economy was gone. The labor system that sustained it was abolished. The railroad routes that had fed the port were rerouted, and nothing comparable replaced any of it. The port still functioned. Lumber and naval stores moved through, but the explosive wealth of the antebellum years was not coming back. Savannah entered the 20th century the way a retired aristocrat enters old age, dignified, beautiful, and slowly running out of money. The city that Sherman considered too lovely to burn was now too lovely to modernize and too broke to maintain. The Savannah Cotton Exchange, that proud building on Bay Street where global cotton prices had once been set, lost its purpose. The port still moved goods, but the city was no longer the center of anything. Savannah's population peaked at about 149,000 in 1960, and then began a slow, steady slide. The grand houses that cotton money had built began to decay. By the 1930s and 1940s, mansions were subdivided into apartments, then left to rot. Landlords collected rent and spent nothing on maintenance. Residents with means moved south to the suburbs, to new ranch houses with driveways and garages. The historic district, all those squares, all that irreplaceable architecture, became a neighborhood of boarding houses, peeling paint, sagging porches, and rising crime. Gas stations sprang up on lots where townhouses once stood. The squares themselves were threatened. Some had already been bisected by new streets to speed car traffic. The city Oglethorpe had designed for people on foot was being redesigned for people in Buicks. And here the story takes its strangest turn. In the 1950s, while cities across America were tearing down their downtowns in the name of progress, building highways, erecting parking garages, demolishing anything that looked old, Savannah was doing the same thing. The beloved city market was demolished in 1954 and replaced with a parking garage. Union Station, the Grand Railway Depot, was torn down in 1963. The Hotel de Soto fell in 1966. A proposed crosstown expressway threatened to slice directly through the historic district. Savannah was on the verge of erasing itself. And then 7 women stopped it. The catalyst was a specific threat to a specific house. In 1955, a journalist, artist, and activist named Anna Colquitt Hunter learned that the Isaiah Davenport House, an elegant Federal-style home built around 1820 on Columbia Square, one of the oldest brick structures in the city, with curved double staircases and restrained Federal detailing, was about to be purchased by a funeral home and torn down for a surface parking lot. Not a highway, not a hospital. A flat rectangle of asphalt where people would leave their cars while they went shopping. Hunter gathered 6 of her friends. They scraped together $22,500. They bought the house, and they formed the historic Savannah Foundation. It sounds like a small act. It was not. In 1955, in the American South, 7 women raising money to stop a demolition was an act of stubborn defiance against everything the post-war economy was telling cities to do. The consensus at the time, among developers, politicians, planners, the federal government itself, was that old buildings were obstacles. Progress meant new. Progress meant fast. Progress meant parking. These 7 women looked at a 200-year-old house about to become a parking lot and said no. That single purchase launched one of the most successful preservation movements in American history. The foundation invented what they called a revolving fund. They would buy threatened properties, stabilize them, and sell them to buyers who committed to restoration. Over its first half-century, the organization is credited with directly saving more than 350 buildings. The squares were protected. The historic district was designated a National Historic Landmark. What had been a decaying, crime-ridden neighborhood became, building by building, something worth visiting. But it took a murder to make the world notice. On the night of May 2nd, 1981, inside a 3-story red brick mansion on Monterey Square, a wealthy antiques dealer named Jim Williams shot and killed a 21-year-old man named Danny Hansford. Williams called the police. He said Hansford had gone on a rampage, smashing an 18th century grandfather clock, pulling a gun, trying to fire it. The gun jammed. Williams pulled a Luger from his desk and shot him. The mansion was the Mercer-Williams House, one of the most striking homes in Savannah. It had been designed in the 1860s by architect John Norris for Confederate General Hugh Mercer, whose great-grandson, Johnny Mercer, would go on to write Moon River and dozens of other American standards. The house sat half-finished through the Civil War, with Union troops camped across the street in Monterey Square and some of its building materials confiscated. When Jim Williams bought it in 1969, the building was abandoned and crumbling. He spent years restoring it to magnificence. Williams was one of Savannah's most prominent preservationists, a man who had made a fortune buying and restoring historic properties. He threw legendary Christmas parties. He collected rare antiques. He was also, in the complicated social calculus of Savannah, not entirely accepted. He wasn't from old money. He wasn't from Savannah at all. And his relationship with Danny Hansford, a young drifter described variously as his assistant, his companion, and his lover, made the polite classes uncomfortable. What followed the shooting was one of the most extraordinary legal sagas in Georgia history. Williams was tried 4 times. The first trial ended in conviction and a life sentence. The Georgia Supreme Court overturned it. The second trial also ended in conviction, also overturned on appeal. The third trial ended with a hung jury, 11-1 in favor of conviction. The fourth trial, moved to Augusta, finally produced an acquittal in 1989. 8 years, 4 trials, 1 dead man, 1 free man. And then, on January 14th, 1990, 8 months and 2 days after his acquittal, Jim Williams dropped dead of a heart attack inside the Mercer-Williams house. He was 59 years old. He was found lying on the threshold of his study, the same room, nearly the same spot on the floor where Danny Hansford had bled out 9 years earlier. According to local accounts, neighbors saw Williams pacing Monterey Square that final evening, sitting on benches, staring at the house as if reluctant to enter. Some versions of the story say Minerva, the Gullah Geechee root doctor who had performed midnight rituals over graves to help Williams beat the charges, was seen leaving the house earlier that night. Whether that detail is documented or legend is something Savannah has never fully sorted out. When asked about Williams's death, Minerva reportedly said 3 words: "The boy did it." Whether that coincidence is evidence of something beyond the rational, or simply the kind of dark poetry that Savannah specializes in, depends entirely on what you're willing to believe. But the story wasn't finished. A New York writer named John Berendt had spent years in Savannah, embedding himself in the city's eccentric social world. He'd arrived in the early 1980s, drawn by Williams's story, but captivated by everything around it. He'd met Williams before the trials, attended his legendary Christmas parties, watched him hold court among rare antiques and Savannah's social elite. He'd met Hansford. He'd met the drag queen called Lady Chablis, who gleefully crashed an annual African-American debutante ball. He'd met a man who walked an invisible dog on a leash through the squares, and a recluse who supposedly kept a vial of poison potent enough to contaminate the city's water supply. And he'd met the root doctor named Minerva, who practiced midnight rituals over graves at Bonaventure Cemetery, grinding graveyard dirt and reciting prayers in the dark to help Williams beat the charges. Berendt wove all of it, courtroom drama, travelogue, character study, ghost story, into a book he called Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Random House published it in January 1994, with a first print run of 25,000 copies, expecting modest regional sales. The book sat on the New York Times bestseller list for 216 consecutive weeks, a record at the time. It sold more than 3 million copies in over 100 printings, was translated into 23 languages, and turned Savannah into one of the most visited cities in the American South almost overnight. In 1994, the year the book was published, Savannah welcomed an estimated 5 million visitors. By 2022, that number had risen to over 17 million. Locals started calling it simply the book, the way people in other cities might refer to an earthquake or a hurricane, a single event that divided time into before and after. And what the tourists came to see was, in large part, the dead. Savannah's haunted reputation had existed long before Berendt showed up, but the book, and the 1997 Clint Eastwood film adaptation, gave it a commercial vocabulary. Ghost tours multiplied. Every square had a story. Every old hotel had a presence. The Marshall House, with its bones beneath the floorboards. The Sorrel Weed House on Madison Square, where 2 women died under tragic circumstances, and visitors now report being shoved by invisible hands. Moon River Brewing Company, where sealed upper floors produce sounds that paranormal investigators call the most aggressive they've encountered. Colonial Park Cemetery after dark, where 9,000 dead lie beneath weathered headstones, and tourists pay $30 to hear about yellow fever by lantern light. There are, according to various counts, more than 250 documented haunted locations in Savannah's historic district alone, the densest concentration of reported paranormal activity in the United States. Whether the ghosts are real is almost beside the point. The industry built around them is enormous. Ghost tours, haunted pub crawls, overnight stays in rooms where people died. Savannah turned its grief into a product and sold it to millions. Consider the economics for a moment. Tourism is Savannah's #1 industry. The historic Savannah Foundation, those 7 women who bought a house for $22,500, created the conditions that made that industry possible. Without preservation, there would be no architecture. Without architecture, there would be no setting. Without the setting, there would be no ghosts. And without the ghosts, there might not be enough to keep 17 million people coming back year after year. The dead are Savannah's most valuable asset. That sentence sounds cynical, but it's not. It's the central paradox of a city that spent 2 centuries being destroyed by death and then was saved by it. Bonaventure Cemetery itself carries a story that could only belong to Savannah. The land was originally a plantation. During a dinner party held there in the late 1700s, the plantation house caught fire. According to legend, the host ordered the dining table carried out onto the lawn, and the guests continued their meal under the oaks while the house burned to the ground behind them. Whether that story is precisely true or has been polished by a century of retelling, the image is pure Savannah, elegance and catastrophe sharing the same evening. The plantation became a private burial ground, then a public cemetery, and eventually one of the most photographed graveyards in America, largely because of a single statue. Out there among the live oaks and the river breezes, there's a grave that captures the paradox of Savannah better than any other. Little Gracie Watson was born in 1883, the only child of the manager of the Pulaski House, one of Savannah's finest hotels. She grew up in the hotel lobby, singing, dancing, charming the guests, a 6-year-old performing for strangers the way children do when the whole world seems safe. 2 days before Easter in 1889, Gracie died of pneumonia. She was 6 years old. Her father, destroyed by grief, commissioned a young sculptor named John Waltz to carve a life-sized marble statue from a photograph taken shortly before her death. The statue shows Gracie seated, ankles crossed, her right hand resting on a tree stump wrapped in ivy. The expression on her face has been described by visitors as changing depending on the light, smiling in the morning, sorrowful by afternoon. Her parents eventually left Savannah and returned to New England. They never came back. Gracie has been alone in that cemetery for more than 130 years. Visitors leave toys, flowers, and coins at the base of the statue. An iron fence had to be installed to prevent people from touching the marble. Tour guides tell the story, and tourists cry. Then they get back on the trolley and buy a postcard. Grief, beauty, commerce, all braided together in a single grave. That braid runs through everything in Savannah. The cobblestones on River Street were originally ballast stones from ships that came to load cotton. Cotton picked by enslaved hands on plantations owned by men who built the mansions that tourists now photograph. The squares that Oglethorpe designed as gathering places for a community of equals became, within a generation, the settings for slave auctions, yellow fever quarantines, and Civil War encampments. The Mercer-Williams House, designed for a Confederate general, restored by a preservationist who became a killer, made famous by a book about a murder, is now a museum where visitors can see the study where both Danny Hansford and Jim Williams died, for the price of a ticket. Savannah has always been a city of layered contradictions. Founded as a refuge for debtors, it became one of the wealthiest slave ports in America. Designed to last forever by an idealistic English reformer, it was nearly destroyed by fire twice and by disease 3 times. Spared by Sherman as a Christmas gift, it spent the next century quietly falling apart. Saved by 7 women with $22,500 and a refusal to accept the demolition of 1 house. Resurrected by a book about a shooting in a haunted mansion. And now sustained more than anything else by tourists who come to walk among the dead. There's a theory popular among ghost hunters and local guides about why Savannah is so haunted. It isn't just the body count, though the body count is considerable, it's the layering. Cities that burn and rebuild tend to erase their past. The old foundations get torn out, the old bones get relocated, the old grievances get paved over cleanly. Savannah didn't do that. It built on top, layer after layer, century after century. The living stacked themselves on top of the dead without ever fully acknowledging what was underneath. The Native American burial grounds became colonial lots. The colonial graves became sidewalks. The yellow fever dead went into mass pits that nobody mapped. The Civil War amputations went under the floorboards of a hotel that's still renting rooms. Whether that layering produces ghosts in the supernatural sense is something no documentary can settle. But it produces something in the human sense, a feeling that visitors describe again and again, a weight in the air, a thickness, the sense that the ground beneath your feet is not just dirt, but memory, not just stone, but accumulation. And then there are the stories that resist easy explanation. Guests at the Marshall House report hearing children laughing in empty hallways. Faucets turn on by themselves. People have described waking to the smell of decay with no obvious source. At Bonaventure Cemetery, visitors report temperature drops near certain graves and the smell of pipe tobacco near the bench-shaped tombstone of the poet Conrad Aiken. At the Mercer-Williams House, the study where 2 men died in the same spot 9 years apart now sits open for viewing. And some visitors say the air in that room feels different, heavier, colder than the rest of the house. Are these ghosts? Are they stories that visitors bring with them and project onto old rooms and old stones? Are they something in between, a kind of historical residue that buildings collect the way walls collect smoke? Savannah doesn't answer that question. Savannah profits from it. 17 million visitors a year. A historic district that the American Institute of Architects has called one of the most beautiful urban areas in North America. A tourism economy worth billions. A city that in the mid-1950s had no tourism to speak of. Its buildings crumbling, its residents fleeing to the suburbs, its commercial district being systematically demolished, now sustains itself almost entirely on the appeal of what it used to be and who it used to bury. The Cotton Exchange on Bay Street, where global commodity prices were once determined by men in linen suits arguing over bales, is now a Masonic lodge. The warehouses that stored 500,000 bales of cotton a year are now bars and souvenir shops. The Pulaski House, where little Gracie Watson sang and danced in the lobby, was demolished long ago. The Ten Brook Racetrack, where 436 people were sold in 2 rainy days in 1859, is now a lumber yard and an elementary school, marked only by a historical plaque that most residents drive past without noticing. And beneath it all, the layers keep revealing themselves. The first African Baptist church, founded in 1773 and believed to be one of the oldest black congregations in North America, contains holes drilled in its floor in a diamond pattern. For years, the explanation was ventilation. More recent interpretation suggests the holes were breathing passages for people hiding beneath the church as they fled slavery on the Underground Railroad. Whether the evidence is conclusive or circumstantial depends on the historian, but the image, human beings lying beneath the floorboards of a church, breathing through holes the size of a quarter, belongs to the same city that stored severed limbs beneath the floorboards of a hotel. Savannah's relationship with what lies underneath has always been complicated and never fully resolved. The squares remain. 22 of Oglethorpe's original 24, still green, still shaded by live oaks, still arranged in the grid that one man sketched on a bluff nearly 300 years ago. Tourists sit on the same benches where cotton merchants once counted their money and yellow fever victims once coughed blood into handkerchiefs. The benches don't remember. But the city does, in its way, in its particular, profitable, unsettling way. Walk through Monterey Square at dusk. The Mercer-Williams House sits on the western edge, its red brick darkening. The wrought iron fence runs along the sidewalk, each spike pointed like a dagger, except for one. One spike is broken and has been for decades. The story varies depending on who tells it. Some say a boy fell from the roof in 1969 and was impaled on the fence. Some say the broken spike is unrelated. Nobody fixes it. Nobody wants to. The broken spike is part of the tour. Across the square, the moss hangs low enough to touch. The light fades. Somewhere in the distance, a ghost tour group rounds a corner, lanterns bobbing. The guide is talking about yellow fever. The tourists are listening.